Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
Boneless, Part 1, by BearLair64, Anno Domini 1421. Times have been hard, but perhaps the new year will bring better fortunes, Frode assured his friend Thorsten, and to a large degree himself, as they left the church in Havlesi. The trade in walrus ivory has dropped off to almost nil, but we still have plenty of seals to eat. Harder to get grain shipments without the ivory trade, but we may survive yet if we don't lose anyone fleeing to Iceland or Scandinavia. Thorsten nodded. He was soon to be married to a local girl of finer quality than most, Sigrid Bjorn's daughter. He worried for their homeland and for their future. I'm not so sure we can continue in this land with so little trade. We don't want to have to live like the Scalrings. They keep moving closer each year, invading the land we settled and that our folk developed. Almost every man and youth of age is coming on the next hunt. You are right, we won't starve. The salt water stung Thorsten's eyes, yet he managed to peer ahead as the small fleet set out to search for the harp seals that would ensure their town had food. He feared that the dark, bruised-looking sky that loomed to the south of southwest would bring foul weather that would spoil the hunt and postpone the harvest of meat and of what little produce they could eke from the land. The wind had freshened, a warm wind for these latitudes, but anything that made the surface of the sea churn was unwelcome in his reckoning. He was jarred from his task when the boat rocked as though it had hit something. There was no grating, as with the rocks, but the objects had been hard, perhaps a log from a far-off land, carried by the current. He thought hopefully. Wood, even sea-soaked, is always useful and valuable. He scanned the area around the rails, but saw nothing at first. Then a long, pale object that slid beneath the keel. Perhaps an odd whale or shark, he wondered. Then the object grew as it rose from the frigid depths. He could make out swirls of movement as the pallid creature twisted upward towards the craft and the 20 men aboard. It took his senses some time to register that this was only part of a vast creature, a being of legend, a single tentacle of the kraken. He crossed himself and prayed to his god, who had been so strange to his ancestors, to banish the eldritch demonic creature. At last he regained enough sense to cry out to the others, "Prepare for a strike from below." The tentacle did not merely strike the vessel. It bashed into the keel and split the sturdy beam that had traveled so far and had served so well. The ghastly appendage continued to rise as it broke through the deck and writhed in the air above the waves. The men reacted with screams, prayers, or silence, each to his individual want. A few who were close to it dove for the sides, and a few more picked up oars or pulled out knives and attacked the limb, their actions speaking to the blood of their descendants of the old Viking Hersirs who had founded their colony. Thorsten felt the boat heaving and splintering all at once. He aimed himself towards the shoreline that was almost beyond sight and dove. He swam as hard as he could towards the next craft that bobbed nearby, and from which exclamations of consternation emanated over the now heavily churning waves. The crew shouted in terror at what they saw, and then, to encourage Thorsten, watched in horror as another tentacle rose and wrapped itself around the bow of the boat, crewmen and all, their shouts turning to screams of agony. The tentacle squeezed until the shattered remnants of the boat and bodies burst forth in every direction. He continued to swim as best as he could in the turbulent sea. He had a goal. The aft section of the boat had remained mostly intact and now bobbed away from the sallow loop of flesh, which slowly sank once more beneath the waves. He felt the current of its passage drag at him and attempt to pull him in its wake to the cold depths below. Eventually, he was able to catch up to the broken but still floating section of the boat. He crawled up onto it. His oiled seaskin furs had kept out more of the water than he could have ever hoped. He still heard screams coming from everywhere. There was a hunting craft. The noises from dying men and boys. His friends, most of the healthy adult male population of his town, reached him over the strengthening wind that blew him in the right direction on his makeshift raft. He was able to clutch at another piece of flotsam, a portion of plank from yet another shattered craft, and use it as a makeshift paddle. Without the wind and the inrushing tide, he might never have made it to shore. When he drew near to land, he could hear the crashing of waves on the rocks, the sound dreaded by sailors. He paddled as hard as he could, but did almost no good. He was all but frozen despite his furs and oilskins. He feared that his fingers and face would be frostbitten, even if he should reach land alive. He prayed almost constantly. He even silently offered a prayer to the old sea god, Njord, and to his own namesake, Thor, who now raged in his anger against the Jontar, the giants of legend, and made the clouds roil and flash with lightning from his hammer, Mjolnir. He hoped that these were the right deities, and he spared an apology to the Christos for blasphemy. He only wanted to ensure that he survived, that he was there for his Sigrid and the life they had planned. One or more gods seemingly answered his prayers in the most favorable manner, and he was washed over the jagged, jutting surface and deposited on a shore with smaller rocks, more broken than the others. He was bruised and battered, but not broken. Now, if he could find shelter, he had a chance to survive. Inshore, the rocks grew larger and the land rose precipitously. He believed that he had been blown east of the settlement. He knew these shores to be rocky and forbidden, but no more than a few miles from home. He shivered with cold and tucked his mitten-covered hands under his arms. He tucked his face into each of his upper arms in turn and scraped away the layer of ice that had formed in his hair and beard. He scanned the rocks that had become a rock face. There, a crack in the surface. His mind crowed in triumph. He was soon ensconced in a fissure that let in light from above, yet it was enclosed and secure from the blustering winds outside. Still he shivered. He simply could not get warm. The wetness had in the end breached even the oiled seal hide. He checked his pouch and found he still had his fire starter kit. It was mostly dry. He made his way back to the edge of the water where the waves had deposited his makeshift raft. He kicked off a few pieces of the boat and used them to pry apart the rest of the raft, then carried a portion of them back to his intended camping space. After a few more trips back and forth, he was warm enough to pay attention and cold enough to concentrate diligently on getting a fire started with the ice-rimmed pieces. The skill of lighting wet fuel was well known to the shore dwellers in the northern clime, and he was soon accompanied by a merry glow of orange and yellow and the warmth of one of humanity's oldest allies, fire. There was a goodly amount of smoke from the dampness in the wood, but the opening above made for a decent enough chimney. He arrayed the remaining pieces around the fire to let them dry. He had no more kindling and no more fuel for his sparks, so he had to maintain this blaze if he wanted to live. He was still freezing and incredibly hungry, yet his discomfort reminded him that he was alive, perhaps the only member of the hunting party to survive. So many of the men and older boys gone. Surely the thing had been a demon, some conjuring from the past. He heard odd sounds coming from the back of the opening in the rock face, back where the ground above it closed in on itself, and the narrow view of the sky disappeared, to be replaced by the pure, urbane darkness that had found only under the ground. At first there was dead silence, so profound he could hear only the dim ringing that some experience where there was no noise. Then there was a hint of a scraping. Slither. The noise made by a chitin as it slid over a rock. Whatever insect wore this suit of armor was large, at least as large as himself. Chittering squeaks erupted from every direction, and he caught glints of light on hard, gleaming surfaces. Black eyes, numerous spiky legs, waving claws. He coughed and awakened to a nearly extinguished fire. He spent the next several minutes saving the coals and nursing them back into flame. At last he had the fire going again and chanced piling a stick or two onto it. The wood smoked and hissed in protest at the change of basic elements applied to it, but eventually settled into a quiet, popping conflagration. His eyes drooped, and once more he dozed to the sound of a chittering horde, a nightmare of crawling, slithering, twitching insects, sliding rough plates and scales against one another and the surrounding rocks to create a clacking, crawling mass that would have given him chills even without the cold. Thorsten, you are alive! He shivered and shuddered, longing to crawl into the turf fire he could feel crackling nearby. He was now wrapped in dry woolen blankets, and through the cold still racked his body. He checked and felt that his appendages were numb and sore, but still had some sensation. Perhaps he had avoided frostbite after all. He croaked up to the person who had spoken to him, his voice low and dry. How? Froda looked down on him from beside his sleeping mat. We had to wait for the storm to pass. We found wreckage and 2 bodies washed ashore east of Valsi. A few others made it to shore using wreckage to float themselves. We searched along the beach until the rocks got big. We were getting ready to turn back when old Arn, the eagle-eyed, spied smoke rising above the cliff. It took a while to reach you. Your fire was all but gone, and you had piled the last of your wood upon it. We could not wake you. It seemed you were in a trance. It was even harder to carry you back to the settlement. If you're asking how long, the answer is 4 days since the boats were all taken under. You missed the wailing of all the new-made widows and the keening of the mothers who lost so many young sons. I'm glad now that I was chosen to stay behind. Now you must answer some questions. What happened, my friend? He supplied a cup of warm liquor to comfort the abused man. Thorsten stared into the middle distance. He tried to recall, to place himself once more in that terrifying place, in the ridiculously small craft that the kraken tore through like it was made from soft leaves. You won't believe me, he whispered in his now hoarse voice. It was the kraken. He said the last quickly, trying to spit it forth so that even the word would be expelled from his mind. But he could not deny it even to himself. He shifted his eyes to meet those of his friends. Rhoda, it was the monster from the old stories. We've seen the big things that sometimes wash up on shore. the soft and many-armed creatures from the deep waters. This thing dwarfed any living creature. It was so large that it burst through the keel and shattered our boat instantly. Other tentacles wrapped around a boat I swam towards and cut it in half. The men and boys, they screamed and cried. Some choked and others were crushed. The rest likely ended up in the sea. It was full of chop and so cold. He trailed off as his body racked with a shudder, and he began to cough. Once he'd settled, he'd found his voice. Already hoarse, was almost gone. He beckoned Froda to come closer. What happened with the giant insects? From the crevasse where I hid. Did you see them? Froda leaned back, concern on his face for his wounded friend. Thorsten, you must have hallucinations. You certainly have a fever. We found no insects, giant size or otherwise. The crevasse appeared to be clear of anything but sand. It smelled rank, but it's so close to the sea. Nothing unusual. However, it did appear to go back for a long way. Maybe you heard winds scraping over the rock and sand. Thorsten gave a brief nod as he faded once more into healing sleep. When he awakened again, he felt slightly better, though still dry and thirsty. Soft hands held a cup to his mouth, and he drank greedily. A sweet voice soothed him. Easy, Thorsten. You will have all of your want, but take it slow. Sigrid, my love, he thought as he forced his eyes open past the gum and discomfort. There she was in all her glory and beauty. How was such a wretch as he so blessed? He was glad of the thought as it brought tears to his eyes and provided at least a small comfort to them. He managed a hoarse whisper that to him sounded better when he spoke to Froda. Sigrid, my Sigrid, I lived through it for you. Sigrid smiled down at him. I'm so thankful you did, my Thorsten. The widow's life is not for me. Besides, you haven't married me properly just yet. Now, when you've had enough to drink, we'll try some broth. Over the next few days, Thorsten quickly regained his vitality, yet he found that he tended to sleep for longer than usual. His nightmares were stocked with chitterings and scraping and odd stenches. Still, he had to get back to work. So many had been killed by the kraken that the old men, the younger boys, and many of the women now had to hunt to keep the survivors of the settlement fed. As the days came and went, he knew with ever-increasing certainty that the colony would fail. They would not give up all at once, but already ships packed with settlers had begun to leave for Iceland, some to stay and others to continue back to Scandinavia. In any case, none would return to Grönland. The land would be left to the seals, the walruses, and the skrellings. Was all that there was to do. He still managed to escape late one afternoon and make his way to the crevasse, the crack with the rock wall that had preserved his life. He brought a pair of torches and armed himself with a belt axe and long knife. The nightmares ensured that even when he stayed abed for long hours, he did not truly rest. He found that he could never truly keep warm as he was plagued with shivers when he recalled the sounds of the living nightmare that emanated from the depths. Whether from the Christian hell or Niflheim or the sagas, he had no idea, but surely it was a terrible place to belch forth creatures that could produce such hideous noises. He needed to know what was lurking in the darkness. He found the place easily enough. There was nothing unusual on the outside. No evidence that he had ever visited the place. Inside, he found the charred remains of his desperate fire, a black stain on the sandy floor, He was able to use the weak light that filtered in from above for a while as he journeyed into the gloom that grew deeper until he had stopped and strike his fire starter to one of the torches. He planned to go for as long as the first torch lasted, or the crevasse closed in too tightly. He would have the second torch for the return journey. There was no guarantee that they would last the same amount of time, but he was confident that he would find the answers he sought. The walls remained at double arm's width apart, almost uniformly, as if the passage through the solid rock of the earth had been cut with an enormous sword, perhaps deliberately wrought by some elder race. Perhaps the dwarfs or kobolds, he chuckled. I have to stop letting my imagination run wild. Next I'll be seeing the shadows of monsters. The narrow cleft above had apparently closed completely, or night had fallen early. The shadows indeed lengthened. He heard a noise up ahead. Scraping? He asked himself. Perhaps running water from the ice cap had cut, or is cutting a new stream. As he drew closer to the source of the sound, it stilled. The path took a step downward. He realized that he had been on a gentle slope in that direction ever since he had left behind the crack above, with its friendly natural light. He shivered, though the air was not uncomfortably cold, and he was warmly attired. The floor leveled again after a short decline, and once more he heard noises, skittering like the feet of a gigantic spider, the snapping of pincers and the rustling clatter of chitorous plates. The sounds from his nightmares. He nearly walked off a precipice in his fear of the loathsome vibrations. The way ahead opened suddenly, and far below he caught the glint of water and wet armor as masses of enormous arthropods crawled over one another in a mat that rested on and just below the surface of the shallows. The body of water stretched far into the distance, and the roof above soared into the shadows. There was a narrow pathway that branched to the right and followed the walls downward to the water's edge, maybe 40 feet below. He could see the writhing mass and smell their horrid odor. There was a hint of brackishness to the water, perhaps some access to the sea, some deep cavern that connected to the bodies of salt water. He saw that his first torch now guttered and provided only a little light. So he lit the second torch and tossed the first one over the cliff and down into the creatures below. It landed on the broad back of something that resembled a scorpion, though Thorsten had never seen a scorpion, could not have said so. To him it appeared as some form of demon. In the brief time before the creature attempted to flee from the flames, the heat from which finally penetrated its hard casing, Thorsten saw that the monstrous form was surrounded by equally hideous forms in many shapes and sizes. Things that were like insects but inflated to lengths and breadths that ranged from rat size to the size of a large man. They clattered and crawled, some struggled with others, some dined on the corpses of their fellows, or drained fluids from their living bodies. Others seemed to flee hither and thither. The burned creature scuttled forward until it found water deep enough to submerge itself, and the torchlight from below was eternally snuffed. Thorsten looked around at the cavern in the fresh light of the second torch. He saw that the roof was not as high as he had first imagined, yet it was covered in a strange substance, and it moved. He saw figures scuttle. Spiders! They were the size of house cats. He fled back up the pathway, back towards light and life. He'd seen enough and never again wanted to look at such sights, hear such sounds, or smell such odors. I tell you, Froda, my nightmares are real. I don't know why you and the others saw nothing, but that crevice led to a cavern. There's water at the bottom. Sea water, and it's full of gigantic insect things. Thorsten had been tired by the time he had returned, and it was already the dark of night. He had run as far as he could, then stumbled for a while, then run some more. Now he sought the counsel of his best friend and the wisest man he knew. Froda looked at him, silently considering. Thorsten, you are a good man, sturdy, strong, and smart. Let's say you found the gigantic insect things. I believe you. I know you are reasonable. What of it? Before Thorsten could object, he continued, even if they left the cavern, where would they go? What would they do? They are large, yes, but pose no threat. The spiders? Oh, maybe, but they have not traveled above the ground so far as we know. You were wrought up because of your trauma at seeing the other men die. In whatever way they did, you survived, and perhaps you feel some guilt. Perhaps the source of your night terrors. Thorsten considered for a moment. He'd gone to Froda for the very purpose of seeking wisdom, as Odin had sought wisdom in the saga. The Allfather had paid a terrible price with the loss of his eye and the visions of Ragnarok, his doom and that of most of his children, and the destruction of all the worlds of Yggdrasil. He shuddered. I don't want wisdom at such a price. And if Father Knud could hear my musings, he might have my eye burned from the socket for blasphemy. Maybe Froda's right. Nothing to fear from the creatures caught in their deep caverns. I see, Froda. I understand and will try and rest now that I know that I did not imagine the creatures. There is some little comfort in the thought that it wasn't entirely my mind. He nodded. Indeed, there's even more comfort thought. Sigrid, we will have our wedding soon. By the time he left Froda's home, he was smiling. Visions of his sweetheart filling his head and his heart and replacing those of a pit full of horrors or the writhing tentacles of a legendary monster. As the days went by before the wedding, his nightmares decreased in number and intensity. Oversized or not, the creatures were just insects. Even though they appeared like demons, surely they were simply some oddity of nature. Thorsten assured himself of these truths each waking moment. The wedding and the honeymoon that followed were true bliss for him. He and Sigrid settled into a routine, and while he never quite forgot the monsters that lurked in the deep, he no longer dwelt on them. At least, until the kraken sank another ship. This time it was a large vessel, bound for Iceland with fleeing colonists who sought food and more bountiful life than they had in Grönland. Many of those aboard were women and small children. Their screams echoed across the waters. The slimy tentacles rose to wrap oily coils around the vessel, suckers planting on every surface they touched, to include living flesh. Then the craft began to splinter and burst in the foul embrace of the Leviathan of the deep. The ship sprang leaks and started to break when the body of the behemoth bobbed into sight for just a moment. The hideous eye and beak peeked above the surface for just a moment, and then was gone. The bulk of the ship with them, colorful blobs, danced on the waves, clothing and other objects that the pilgrims had taken with them, along with a few swimmers. He and several others noticed at the same time and called out to those nearby to take boats and rescue the survivors. Most of those on the dock were terrified. Many had fled. Thorsten found himself in a boat with an elderly man who lacked a right hand, and a middle-aged woman with a careworn face, one of the widows of the first encounter with the kraken. They managed to get one of the smaller rowboats out into the water, and soon they fished out any floating object that appeared to be a survivor. They brought home 5 in total. The rest were already dead from the attack or drowned in the aftermath. The entire time, Thorsten rode and directed the others. Now on the way back, he could think only of the creature rising once more, sending one of its tentacles to crush him and the others, to grip their bodies and gulp them into its terrible maw with the savage beak. The thing met and included all of the remaining adults in the community. There were not many. Froda led the discussion. It is clear we cannot stay. We will starve, despite the meat we catch. Nor can we leave. It is not safe to enter the water. Those in the ship claim to be the last of the settlers in the western colony. But there may be more survivors. Perhaps we should form an expedition and seek out our brethren and succor them if we may. Maybe with a combined effort we can escape this land that has become accursed. Thorsten raised an immediate objection. Even if they are still there and have ships and space to spare, they will have to sail past this part of land, directly into the horror that lurks just off our shore. There was some intense exchanges as the fears of each person raised their tempers and shouted angrily, and accusations soon flew. The community was on the verge of disintegration by the time some semblance of order was restored. Froda, voice still raised, did what he did best. He reasoned. So we send a small party to the west and another to the east to see if the kraken had ravaged the Skraelings or any of our kin who have ventured to live out on their own. I will go west and Thorsten will lead a party eastward. If we do not return inside a month, you must do what you think is best. But I would recommend that you take ships and flee in the night. So far, the kraken has attacked in the mornings. Perhaps the late afternoon or evening, it will be at rest. The thing broke up after general agreement, and the parties prepared to depart at first light. So quote, this raven Thank you so kindly for stopping by my chateau, my darlings. It does mean so much to me. Please, if you have not subscribed, as many of you have not, please do so. Give me a like so I know what you would like to hear. And comment. I always love to read your comments. And special thanks to my Patreon and membership supporters. Ciao, darlings.